Time grows short, the dawn grows dim. Time grows short, the sun. Here's today's real existential dilemma. All these flight cases and really useful boxes of LPs and Blu-rays, and behind them my A format stash with its infamous text blocks outwards, and I've got to move all this stuff to get these in because these are all Sturgeons and Shaw, and the S's are just below that level, and oh gosh, it's an endless sort of turmoil. A box full of trade paperbacks, some read, some unread, just in a box like that because there's nowhere else for them to go. Stuff to go on eBay. A Sketchers box full of reading copies, which is a new project. This is what faces the science fiction devotee at this time in life in the small home. Time grows short. The sun dims. How much is left? It's time for maybe a bit of self-indulgence and some rumination. I've thought for a while that I'd like to do something where I just talk about whatever I feel about science fiction and writing and books. Not something clickbaity or theme-based or what have you. And it took me back to the early 90s when briefly I co-wrote a fanzine with other local friends and fans in Bath, which ran for 2 issues, and the third, which was my guest editorial, never got published, which kind of tells you everything really. And we did a column, Graham and I did a column. No, it wasn't Graham and I, we did some collabs and some essays. I was doing a column called Impositions, which I later thought was a pretentious title, but it was based on the idea that all we can do creatively is impose ourselves on situations, crash the party. And fanzines are a classic example of that. You know, you impose yourself upon the field or genre or whatever you're imposing yourself on, and you make a statement, and you hope that it's heard and listened, and in doing so you find your voice and you become part of that community. And this has all been spurred on by that thing that you do. I don't know if you do, I do it, just picking up an old book at random, or not at random, because it speaks to you from the shelves and you start to read it. And I do this a lot with non-fiction, and I do it with the works of Barry N Malzberg. And Barry's somebody I'm very passionate about. I've done one brief video doing an overview of his A format UK paperbacks, and he is mentioned in the recent videos where I sit in the pub with my friends James Reich. And let's see, I've got 2 of James's books here. Soft Invasions, which is my favourite. That's the one Michael Moorcock liked. And the more recent one, The Song My Enemies Sing, which is the one that Barry Malzberg himself liked. More on James and those later on. Yeah, if you go back a few weeks, you'll see there's a two-parter. It's a two-parter because I had problems technically with editing, where I sit in the pub with James Reich and Alistair McNaught, another writer. And the second part, which is called The Battle of Los Angeles, is probably more germane to everybody interested in SF. And we talk about writing and sort of all the stuff. And is it pretentious? Well, as Brian Eno and David Bowie said, they invented a whole new school of pretension, and art is the plane you can crash and walk away from. So that's okay. It's all about the exploratory thing. But anyway, I picked this book off the shelf last night, and it's got a slightly dinged edge there because one day when I was squeezing it back into its very, very tight place in what I call my interesting shelves, it's sort of folded over, and that sort of thing really gives me pain because that doesn't happen with my books very often. It's not something that I'm guilty of, but it happened. And again, it's kind of analogous for where Barry is in literary history, a tiny little space he's afforded, and he's an obscure figure. And this, as you can see, is a book called The Bend at the End of the Road, and I'm going to talk about that and various other things as we go on today. This is its predecessor, which is called Breakfast in the Ruins. I'm not sure if this is still available. This, ironically, is published by Bayon, and Bayon, of course, have this reputation for doing right-wing militaristic SF, and an SF writer I know recently turned down an option to appear in a Baen anthology because he was concerned what people might think that he was appearing in that. And I really didn't think that's a good idea as a career move. I'd have gone for it in a shot because, you know, first of all, you're eroding from within. You're the worm in the apple. And, you know, Baen have done some good stuff. You know, it's not all bad. And the irony is that Malzberg, you know, is the last person you'd associate with Baen, and yet this is a Baen book. Normally it's, you know, Poul Anderson, Robert Heinlein, and, you know, David Drake and all the people now who are writing things like the Hannah Harrington books, those sort of things. So there you go. When this was first published, it was called Engines of the Night, and then it was confusingly expanded and retitled as Breakfast in the Ruins. I say confusingly because, of course, long ago Michael Moorcock produced this experimental novel, Breakfast in the Ruins, and this is a quasi sequel to Behold the Man, his most shocking new wave work. And this is very experimental, and it takes the character of Carl Glogower, and just to illustrate the contingency of time, I can hear an alarm going off. This always happens in my videos, but it is an indicator of, you know, things running down, the new wave, the entropy and all that stuff, so we'll just ignore it. Yeah, so confusingly it was retitled, and Engines of the Night is a quite big chunky series of essays about science fiction. And, you know, Malzberg, you know, what is he a hardcore miserablist? Some people would say yes. Now, to me, that doesn't bother me at all. He does have a fairly pessimistic outlook and things, but it's based on experience of life. And in one of my interviews with Christopher Priest, I asked him whether he'd ever met Barry, and he'd said how gloomy Barry was, and it was a very brief meeting. And, you know, Chris is not above the rueful himself, and I guess one could say in Barry's defense, well, Barry never ever sold a book to a Hollywood studio, unlike Chris. Not that, you know, one should sort of look down on Chris for that at all. Not at all. He deserved it. And, you know, it's a great shame. It's the fault of the Hollywood studios and filmmakers generally that they're not making great books by people like Chris and Barry into films and putting some coin in their coffers. That's the way it should be. But no, we mostly get derivative crud. So there we are. So this is all sort of essays and what have you, and it got a lot of attention. It might have even won some awards, I can't recall, and it's bagged, as you can see, and I don't have the energy this morning to take it out, even though I'm in recovery, I'm on steroids, I'm feeling better, it's my day off. I would like to go out for a walk, but I have to stay in for a good while at least, because there are legacy titles coming in the post and from couriers. I have to be here to sign for those parcels, and they daren't be left in a porch. You know how it is. Do you remember before the pandemic when Amazon asked you where you wanted your parcel left, and you could leave a detailed instruction and, you know, tuck it here, tuck it there, and they would do it? No, they still ask you, but it gets left in plain view when there are places where it could easily be hidden. So I have to wait in because there's important legacy titles coming, and you'll see those unboxed or displayed in the next collector diary. It's part of the final library, and final's an important word in what we're talking about today, because we're talking about moving towards the end, as it were. Oh God, he's been infected by Malzberg already, they say, those who know the work. But yeah, and then there's this book which came later, and this again is essays. These were columns from magazines and even some online stuff from about 2007 onwards. And you'll notice the title is The Bend at the End of the Road. So it's not the actual end, that there is a bend, which suggests that there might be a way out of where science fiction is heading. And I guess that's really the topic for today. Where is science fiction heading? Where is it? What's gone wrong? What's gone right? What's happening? And that's probably the over sort of arching theme of what this series will be if it turns into a series, because it's definitely not going to be clickbait and crowd pleasing. It's just going to be a bit more introspective than that. So it is what it is, as we say. So I was reading these, and basically what Barry does, he riffs repetitively on science fiction. And of course, he was first published in the late 60s. He had high ideals. He wanted to sort of conquer the mainstream in SF and become a major figure. And I think he is. I think he did a wonderful job. But of course, he wasn't to everybody's taste. And his last full-blown SF novel was in the early 80s, the remaking of Sigmund Freud, which was a book that was too big, I felt, and about the only one of his novels which I never really got on with. It went so far and then didn't sort of go any further. The weariness was there. I had the feeling that its size was possibly because of things being imposed from above about how long an SF book should be in the early 80s. I've talked about this elsewhere. Or maybe it's just the fact that he was losing it. He followed that with a collection from Arkham House called In the Stone House, and the stories in that seem more diffuse, and for somebody who loves his style, it was a real shock that I struggled to sort of shape those narratives, and for the narratives to find a shape with me. He was in his voice deeper and deeper, and ever since then I've wondered, is it just that Barry passed his prime, passed his peak, and was no good anymore? You read these and you think, no, he was still really good. It's just that he was overwhelmed by what had or hadn't happened. What hadn't happened was that he and others had failed to save literary science fiction from the onslaught of the growth of fantasy. And he talks about exactly the same things I do in the way that fantasy went from the late 70s onwards, but he goes back further, saying it was always there, but it's grown and swamped SF, and what Star Wars and Star Trek did to the genre, particularly Star Wars, and dumbing it down. He recants on Star Trek, and I think he's got a point. But I would say if you've read his work and you haven't read these, do read them, because you will learn a lot. He focuses on the 1950s as the core period of when SF really came into its own, and there were lots of classics and things really came together. And increasingly, I think he's got a point. I cleave to the 60s largely because I like a lot of British writers who did their key work in the 1960s, but we will come back to this. But he presents lots of evidence. Was it also just his age, that he was the right age at that time? As Thomas M. Dish said, golden age of science fiction is 13. So, was it just that he was the right age? And it feels that way. We all have our place and context and history and time that shapes our taste. But the question is, do we have a philosophy behind them? And that's something I'll come on to in another video. And I keep promising to do this, talking about modernity, post-modernity and SF, and why I feel the way I do about SF now. But that will come in a future edition of this August series, which we're beginning now, he said laughingly. So really something that Barry said in one of the essays in this book, and it's not for beginners. I mean, you are better to read these if you've read his work and if you know a bit about 50s SF particularly. He writes about other decades as well. Is that he says that writing really comes down to one thing, and it comes down to voice. And you become a good writer when you find your own voice. And the imposition, the act of imposing, is of putting your voice into things, and it has to be your voice. So all writers struggle to find their voice, and some are luckier than others. It's there, and any writing which doesn't employ voice is sort of commercial. And even in the best commercial fiction, there's an element of voice. I think of Peter Benchley's Jaws with its bleakness. There is a voice there. Not essentially a distinguished one, but there is a voice there, and voice is something that writers should aim for. And if it's one thing that Malzberg has above all else, it's voice. One of his detractors said that he had one story and he just told it over and over again. And this to me isn't a problem. Most great artists have one theme or one point or one area they want to work with, and they come at it from different angles. It's rather like J.S. Bach doing variations on themes, and this is mentioned by John Clute in one of the introductions to a later edition of Moorcock's final programme for Jerry Cornelius, of using it as a template. And I've no issue with this. Ballard did this, it's all the greats sort of do it really. Malzberg does it, and people like they like what they like. They like the repetition as a form of change, as Eno said. Except in music, when he said that, repetition isn't really a form of change, is it? It's just repetition, but it's your inner state that's altered by it. So there you go. And it's like that with writing. It's that way of taking things from different angles and examining your thesis, speaking in your voice. Something else that Barry mentions in the books is he says he quotes Norman Spinrad, something that Spinrad said, I think, in the early 90s, and this is Spinrad's Science Fiction in the Real World, great book. And he says that Spinrad said, and as I say, this would have been early 90s, science fiction is now a minority interest at science fiction conventions. You know, it's something that's in a corner. And, you know, if it was like that in the 90s, which is the point that I stepped away from science fiction, for a good 5 or 6 years, I stepped away from it. And even though I was reading my favourites, Moorcock, Ballard, Priest, Gibson, even though I was reading those people, I was stepping away from the new. And anybody remembers my ill-fated 90s TBR from last year, you know, I'm looking up now, and behind the camera I can see I've reduced the stack down. There's 3, 4, 5, there's 6 books up there. And one of them I've tried to read and I feel I should go back to, but the others, well, we'll see, I guess. But it's a grim thing. But Spinrad's statement about how science fiction was being leached away is absolutely true if you know real science fiction, the written stuff up until, you know, the end of the 1980s, when everything seemed to change, and 10 years of Star Wars and the mass media exploding sort of swamped the original SF, literary SF, in everything else, you know, and more people come in from screens, and we all come in from screens, as I say, even people my age and older. From the very beginning, the screens were there with Elita and Metropolis in the 1920s. But really, what is this? Is it an elegy for Malzberg? Well, Malzberg, he wrote about himself, you know, and that detractor, he made the comment that, you know, Wagner and Henry Miller told the same stories again and again. And I think you can apply that to almost, you know, every great writer. And I look at where we are today, and I look at why I haven't published much fiction. One short story in that fanzine, which was like a Heinlein type thing. And it was strange. We were given a theme or a picture. I think it was a picture was given to us by the editor of the first issue, Ben Staveley Taylor, who worked for Kerosena. So he didn't work for Kerosena, that was his side job. He worked for Future Publishing, a magazine company, and these Discos magazines are on the way out, really. And then, this would have been in the early 90s, he presented us with a picture and he said, write a short story, 200 words, something like that, about this. And I think 5 of us were doing the fanzine together. And it was weird because the person who most liked the traditional SF of, say, Heinlein, turned out a story that mentioned Angela Carter that was a mood piece, and it was sort of cod cyberpunk. And I wrote a very old school golden age type thing about murder with a ball peen hammer on a colony planet, you know, and about the necessity of ignoring art and getting on with the job of survival, which wasn't me at all, but it was what the picture suggested. It was quite funny, really, because you saw people's desire to be seen and to impose a voice coming out in what they wrote. I felt that maybe I was more honest and maybe more reductive. I wanted to write a story, so that was my thing. And if I still got it, I probably haven't. It's, you know, it wasn't important. My other only published short story is in an issue of Deep Ends, and that really is to agree in my voice, you know. And is it autobiographical? I think one of the few things any writers can do that's authentic is put themselves into it. Their voice must come through autobiography. I feel that every writer ultimately writes about themselves, even if it's indirect, because they're presenting their vision or a vision they want to present. So even if they're advancing masked with a image they want to project, that image is them, or at least is part of them, a facet of their personality. So how plangent and how telling that is depends, I guess, on how good the prose is and how good the story is. So it's a dialectic between the concealed and the revealed. So if I return to writing fiction, which I'm hoping to do next year, early next year, because I've got a publisher interested, really, you know, there will be things which are based on my experiences, but they won't have me as a character. The character will not be me. It's just things will come out of it, and we'll see what happens with that. It's easy to talk about these things. It's much harder to sit down and do it. And I've got a great excuse at the moment in that I'm busy doing this, and that I need to get to work on the reissue of 100 must-read fantasy novels, which hopefully will happen. It's a waiting game now to see when Bloomsbury drop the rights, and then I start to work on the MS. And I think the idea is I'll get the manuscript together and revised and changed in whatever way it needs to be, and then you know, we'll get the publishing thing together. I've got somebody interested. I may do it myself on Amazon. We'll see what happens. But then those of you interested might be at least be able to pick up a physical copy, because I hear it's going for silly money now. So, which, you know, don't pay, because, you know, I'll try and get the new one out there before too long. So, you know, Malzberg, Voice. Who's left? You know, what is left is Voice. I just want to return to Voice a moment, because, you know, I as I said, I think maybe Barry has lost it more, and my friend James, as I say, has had this wonderful acclaim from Moorcock for Soft Invasions and for Malzberg, and I just want to read what they say. And let's just see, what did Malzberg say on the front of this book? He says, absolutely astonishing. And James is influenced by Malzberg, because I once loaned James one of his books, as I knew he'd like them, and it went from there. And also Moorcock. But Moorcock, like Malzberg, is somebody who Malzberg didn't stop writing fiction, but his output really slowed down. A few collections here and there, not much since the 80s. And, you know, some of it I didn't like, some I liked more than other parts. There's a really good little book which is short stories, some of them by Mike Resnick, there's co-authored things. And really, Moorcock, however, I've struggled with since the early 90s. The 80s was a great period for him, and then it's been very much, I like one book and not another, and he seemed to be growing more diffuse, both of them more diffuse. And those sort of elements and influences, I felt to a degree, are in James's books, and really they're not easy books, they're difficult books, they're challenging books, but they do have their voice. Sometimes I think, what is James trying to articulate here? And, you know, he's making you do the work, but it is his voice. Now, it's a strange thing between voice and senescence, and maybe I felt that Moorcock and Malzberg are getting senescent, they're getting too old, they're growing fuzzy. You know, I see this in myself, and, you know, you see it in writers. Knut Hamsun, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, who wrote Hunger back in the late 19th century, one of the great existentialist novels. He wrote wonderful, wonderful novels about alienation and solitude and the country and fresh air, and they're deceptively simple narratives. But Hamsun fell from favour because as he got older, he became more of a proponent for fascism and said some positive things about Hitler, and that sort of excommunicated him from the literary and cultural world. And you can tell when you read his last books that, you know, the guy has Alzheimer's or something similar. He's completely lost it. The meanderings of the prose, the formlessness. He hasn't got to a new level in his art and his voice. He's losing his voice. He's lost his voice. He's senescent. It's the end of time for him. So we have to forgive that, maybe. Obviously, the implications of what he said, you know, weren't helpful. And he did get to meet Hitler, and, you know, they fell out, which I see as something in Hamsun's favour. Not that I'm comparing Hamsun to Moorcock and Malzberg and Reich here. I'm just saying that voice sometimes can be too diffuse. You want to pull it back. In my own writing, my own fiction, the diffusion is part of the voice. So I guess you'll have to see, if you want to find out about that, I guess you'll read Saucer Occupant and Deep Ends. And if anybody's interested, it's a good issue of Deep Ends. There's lots of other stuff in there better than mine. Porter Filippo is in there. Maxim Jakubowski, some real writers. So there you go. So where is this going? I guess, again, I'm using this as a vehicle to talk about Barry and why I think he's important. And the problem is, you know, he has a small amount of work in print. If you want to read his work, you can get Beyond Apollo and Anti-Oedipus Press. It's an introduction by James. You can also get Galaxies. This is a Carolyn Graft one. This is a good one to start with. Knowing where to start with Barry is tough. I would say one of the major books, Beyond Apollo. This one, Galaxies. And another one, which really gets you under his skin and into his soul, is Horowitz World, which is the story of an alienated science fiction writer, but it also has a science fiction story wrapped around it. So it's got this clever frame narrative. And, you know, it does show you the despair that Malzberg had within the SF field and how things were going by the early 70s, within a few years of starting what would be a glittering career artistically, but an increasingly failing one commercially. And really, it was the readership's fault rather than his, I feel. But, you know, people don't like that. But I've said it, so it is what it is. Also, I find myself now, I'm reading something by a famous Japanese writer who I really like. And then I've decided to read 3 books for a thematic video coming up. And I want to read them. One of them is bigger than I thought, which is giving me the fear. And you know what I'm like about big books. I often think they're not necessary. And I find today what I really want to read is this. Stark House have done these Malzberg books. There's a picture of Barry as he is these days. And of course, Barry's like the Robert Quine of science fiction. You know, Robert Quine from Richard Hell and the Voidoids, big Velvet Underground fan, great guitar player. Barry's rather like that, really. If you're a rock and roller, you'll get the analogue. This is an omnibus of Night Raider and Bay Prowler, 2 of the novels which Barry published as Mike Barry. And they're sort of like these vigilante thrillers, and they've done a few of them. There's 3. I must check if there's more. And I've had these on my shelf for months. Barry Malzberg novels I haven't read. I think there are about 14 of these originally, and they never got over here. They lay format paperbacks with wild covers, the sort of things that people who like vintage fiction and pulp absolutely adore. And I once saw a full set on ABE, and they were really good, Nick. They were $140 plus postage, so I balked for reasons of financial survival. And you know, so I've got these to read, and I must check if there are more. So that's what I really want to do, is sort of sit down and read them. But we have our duty to our audience, as they say laughingly. But you know, it's just that desire to bring those things up. So really, Barry's career is rather in the enclosure, and this is a typical Malzberg tale. This is aliens captured by Earthmen being interrogated, and there's sort of lots of horror and torture and general degradation, and you know, and he can't keep away from these charming topics. But you know, he's great. I find him very bracing. He always sounds so negative, but I love his work. I find it funny and black and mordant and witty. He's like a cross between Thomas M. Dish, the sort of accessible end of Thomas M. Dish, meshed with the muscle of Silverberg and the clarity of the writing, and you know, the craziness of Philip K. Dick. And you can see his debts to people like Kuttner and a lot of the early SF writers he loved, C.M. Kornbluth, those sort of people, Bester. And you know, so you really should give him a try. You know, he really is quite something. So try and get one of the books I've cited by him. Do I really have anything else to say today? I don't think I do. I think I've rambled on long enough. If you enjoy this, let me know. It's unfocused, I know. It's sort of coming out the way it is. And maybe next time I'll talk more about my feelings about how science fiction has been drowned by fantasy and where it is now, because it is a big issue. And how it's not fantasy, and it's not fantasy readers, it's publishing. It's the way publishing has gone, how publishing hasn't helped us. And you know, it does need to be discussed. It's ironic because my fantasy videos are amongst the most watched on the channel, and here I am talking about getting back to work on the fantasy book. But you know, it'll mostly be an historical overview. I think the rejigging, the way I'm feeling at the moment. So thanks for watching. Remember, impose your voice. The internet is there. You can say stuff. You can do stuff. And you know, it's not all about escapism. Real science fiction isn't about escapism. We all like the escapist stuff. We all like a bit of mind candy, but it's not really about that at all. It's about the serious issues and where we are now, where we've been, and where we're going. And you know, the Earth is the only alien planet, as JGB said. You know, so we'll see what comes out of this. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Read some Malzberg. No, God, please do read some Malzberg and let me know what you think. I really want to know. Bye for now.